Thank you. Thank you, Corey. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Michael Rubin from the American Enterprise Institute and his lecture titled, Can Diplomacy Tame Iran? You may have seen the bio, but I will read it briefly. Dr. Rubin is a resident scholar in foreign and defense policy studies at AEI. His major research area is the Middle East, with a special focus on Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Kurdish society. He also writes frequently on transformative diplomacy and governance issues. He also chaired at AEI the Dissident and Reform in the Arab World Conference series, and he is a lead drafter of the Bipartisan Policy Center's special report on Iran. In addition to his work at AEI several times each month, Dr. Rubin travels to military bases across the United States and Europe to instruct senior U.S. Army and Marine Corps officers deployed to Iraq and Kuwait and Afghanistan on issues relating to regional state history and politics, Shiism, the theological basis of extremism, and strategy. He received a BS in biology and an MA and a PhD in history from Yale University. I will just take a second to say I met Dr. Rubin actually giving these briefs to U.S. military units abroad and find his take on Iran and politics in the Middle East and Central Asia very informative and very instructive. And so I look forward to this talk as well. And then we'll make one final comment that if he says anything bad about me, it's not true. There, hopefully I will steal his opening joke line if he had one in mind. At that, I will turn the time over to Dr. Rubin.
Well, I wish I had an opening joke line. I was going through on the ride from Salt Lake City all the potential opening jokes, and Dodge just shook his head at each one and said, that's not appropriate. So let me go right into my talk. And I'll talk for about a half hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. But by all means, if I say anything that's not clear, just interrupt me and I'll give a quick clarification. I'm one of these people, I don't believe in death by PowerPoint, nor do I believe in actually reading lectures verbatim. I have a brief outline, but I can adjust in any way in which you folks are interested. However, Iran is the chief subject in the news. It's also a subject close to my heart. I come from an academic background working on Iran. My PhD dissertation, which I did with at the same time as Professor Choate, was on the telegraph in 19th century Iran, during the course of which I had opportunity to live in Iran. I was doing some research at the University of Tehran. They all called me Pesari Shaitani Bozorg, which in Persian means son of the great Satan. And at the same time, I found myself in remedial language classes there because they all told me I spoke Persian like an Afghan taxi driver. At any rate, there's no doubt, though, and so aside from the politics and the diplomacy of my lecture, I'll gladly go on to any tangent about Iranian culture or Iranian history beyond just what we see in the headlines. Because my interest with Iran, while I do tend to do a lot of writing with regard to the current diplomatic issues and so forth, my interest in Iran is actually much deeper, and so it's actually a pleasure that I get to lecture on something that's so close to my heart. Now, there's no doubt that Iran is at the forefront of diplomacy right now, and the forefront of headlines. It was within a week after President Obama took office, that he got on Al Arabiya television and he told Iran that we wanted to unclench our fist. He asked them to unclench their fist to us to have sort of a reset, spelled correctly, written correctly, about U.S.-Iranian diplomacy. And in the news media, much of this was seen as a new approach, a fresh approach, but that isn't really the case. There's always a tendency in Washington, where I unfortunately live now, which tends to see the problems of diplomacy and the failures of diplomacy as primarily being the fault of one's predecessor rather than one's adversary. So what I want to actually do is go through and add some context to the Iranian diplomacy, which we have right now, with the takeaways that much of what we're seeing now isn't new, and that the situation is far more complex than is often portrayed, and hence there is no magic diplomatic formula. That doesn't mean that diplomacy won't work, but it's not as simple as sometimes portrayed. It's not as simple as simply asking to unclench one's fist. Now, it's kind of ironic. I remember when I was first started TAing, teaching. I TA'd a class assistant taught, just grad student taught, sections on American political history. And this I think, was back in 1997, when I was still heavily at work and writing my dissertation. And the students in the class, one of the first questions I asked was, what is your earliest political memory? And at the time, I'd be lucky if people talked about Michael Dukakis. Now, 12 years later, perhaps we'd be lucky if people talked too much about the first term of Bill Clinton. This is dangerous because in Washington, where a lot of people get parachuted into their jobs, become instant experts and so forth, there tends to be amnesia about some of the past initiatives, diplomatic initiatives, especially in the pre-Google era, where it doesn't readily pop up. But every single president since Jimmy Carter has sought outreach to the Islamic Republic of Iran. A lot of people think that the crisis between the United States and Iran started with the Islamic Revolution. No, it actually started after that. Remember that on November 1st, 1979, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is Carter's national security advisor, went over to Algiers, where he met with the Iranian foreign minister Ibrahim Yazdi and the Iranian defense minister, shook hands, November 1st, 1979. This appeared in this photograph of the Americans shaking hands with the Iranians, appeared the next day in the newspapers in Tehran, and 2 days later the U.S. Embassy was seized. Just remember, the U.S. Embassy was opening and functioning more than 9 months after the Islamic Revolution, and even longer after the chaos had really started. We hadn't broken relations. And even after the U.S. Embassy was seized in November 1979, we didn't actually close the Iranians' embassy in Washington until April of the next year because the Carter administration wanted to keep an opening possible for dialogue. Now, the embassy was seized, and on November 6th, 2 days after it was seized, Gary Sick, who's a professor now at Columbia University, at the time was in the National Security Council, leaked to, I believe it was the Boston Globe, that the United States was not considering any military action or anything other than diplomacy to free the hostages. Subsequent interviews with Iranian officials long after the hostage crisis ended suggest that when the Iranian students heard this who had seized the embassy, they thought that their action was going to be very short-term because they weren't suicidal. When they heard that there would be no direct military consequences for what they did, they decided to sit pretty, and that extended the hostage crisis. And the hostage crisis extended. Carter sought any number of different means to reach out to the Iranians. And this raises a lot of questions about now. One of the first things, he did two strategies simultaneously. First, he reached out to international organizations. He got the International Court of Justice, after just 17 days, to issue an emergency ruling declaring the hostage seizure illegal. And in interviews after the hostage crisis was resolved, many of the Carter administration officials said this is what got international legitimacy on our side. Indeed, the United Nations Security Council also issued resolutions, I believe 2 resolutions, before finally the Soviet Union vetoed any further resolutions that would include embargoes and so forth and other forms of pressure on Iran. Peter Rodman, the late Peter Rodman, he passed away last August, much too young. As many of you know, he was an assistant to Kissinger and to 5 different U.S. presidents. His new book is out that he wrote shortly before he succumbed to leukemia. It's a brilliant book. Had written an article, long forgotten, in the Washington Quarterly in 1981, in which he talks about the lessons of the hostage crisis. And he actually said that, on one hand, while you did gain legitimacy, it did take 17 days to get that emergency world court ruling. And in that 17 days, the situation solidified, that one lost the momentum. And even after one got the United Nations Security Council resolutions, eventually they got vetoed because the UN Security Council, on one hand, it's a noble institution. It was founded for noble purposes. But states like the Soviet Union at the time, other states now, don't shed their domestic political agendas when they walk into it and just embrace the ideology. In fact, Peter Rodman advanced the argument that more than any diplomacy to solve the hostage crisis, what really solved the hostage crisis was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran, made the continued holding of the hostages too expensive, if you will, for an increasingly isolated Iran. So he said, despite all this diplomacy and all the Carter administration backslapping about its success upon the release on the day that Reagan was inaugurated, that it really wasn't the diplomacy which solved the hostage crisis. At any rate, it still is an interesting lesson in diplomacy. Carter sought to reach out immediately to anyone he could talk to, but the problem was he didn't know who he could talk to. Like President Obama, the first thing he did was write a letter. He wrote this letter, and he gave it to two men who he thought would be acceptable to the Iranians to deliver to Ayatollah Khomeini. One was Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General under President Kennedy, who by that time already was a well-known radical, and the other to William Miller, who was a former U.S. diplomat fluent in Persian, who had served on, I believe, the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence, and was an outspoken opponent of the Shah and proponent of Khomeini, talking about how Khomeini was a liberal, a progressive, and so forth. He sent these folks over, and they landed in Istanbul, but like Obama, he made the announcement in the press that this letter was to be delivered, at which point Khomeini gave down the order saying, no American intermediaries are welcome. They sat in Istanbul for about 2 weeks, came back, letter undelivered. Next thing Carter sought to do was to reach out to various Iranian figures who suggested a willingness to talk. One of the first of these was Mehdi Bazargan, who was for 2 weeks foreign minister. We reached out to him right after he became foreign minister. And he sat down and he made some demands. Well, we sat down and we talked about meeting the demands, and within 2 weeks he was gone. The next person who was brought in was an Iranian foreign minister. His name was Sadat Khubzadeh. And this created an interesting dynamic. We had Carter administration officials talking about how he was a disgusting figure. This is in the memoirs afterwards. They weren't coloring negotiations with this ahead of time. And they really didn't want to reach out to him, but they had to take what they could get. Well, the problem was he added demands. And we got into this dynamic where every Iranian official, as they sought to solidify their own revolutionary credentials, would seek to add demands. So rather than engagement occurring without a cost, every time we reached out to a new person to engage, the threshold which we needed to surpass to solve the problem grew even longer. And the rest of the story is well known. There were other intermediaries which came. The Carter administration reached out to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, for the first time. This is about 9 years before we formally recognized the PLO. And it was an amazing concession to sit there at the time when the PLO was so heavily engaged in terrorism and say, well, you reach out to Khomeini and pass messages. We legitimize the PLO. After all, people say Sunnis and Shia don't get along. The first foreign leader to visit Tehran after the Islamic Revolution was Yasser Arafat, a Sunni secular Marxist. He was the one that Khomeini first embraced. However, that mechanism went nowhere. And finally, basically we kept grasping at all these straws. Meanwhile, from a U.S. perspective, there's no doubt, whichever side of the political spectrum you're on, that the hostage crisis really eroded it really undercut the Carter administration. Long story short, Saddam Hussein invades Iran. Through a German channel at the end, the Iranians agreed to negotiations and they released the hostages through a German channel initially and then through Algiers. And the agreement was one that certainly was not favorable to the United States. We negotiated under pressure. We agreed to pay back Iran a certain amount of money. We agreed to non-interference, but it was a one-way non-interference. They didn't agree to non-interference in our affairs. We agreed to non-interference in their affairs, although under international law, this wasn't a treaty. It was never ratified by the Senate, and there's a lot of other issues regarding negotiating under fire like this. Hostages were released. Reagan started with a clean slate, or so he thought. And for the first years of the Reagan administration, Reagan was there was the economic difficulties. There were other issues going on. There was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Iran took the back burner. The hostages were out. However, a few things happened. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. The U.S. helped broker a deal by which the Israelis would withdraw and the PLO forces would evacuate to Tunisia. The Lebanese government was shaky on its own, though. The president was assassinated soon after this, and a multinational force, Americans, British, French, and Italians, went in to stabilize the situation. Hezbollah attacked the Americans, one of the first main suicide bombings, and in 1983, 263 or 243 U.S. Marines were killed in that suicide truck bombing. Now, in the course of the Lebanese Civil War, several Americans were taken hostage, and some were killed. Reagan Reagan, after saying under no circumstances during the campaign, actually with Alexander Haig saying during the campaign, under no circumstances would he ever negotiate for the release of hostages, Reagan found himself doing just that. And this actually pulls backwards to a meeting in the National Security Council, which National Security Advisor Bud McFarlane had, in which Bud McFarlane asked an open question: do we have any leverage over Iran? What happens when Khomeini, this Ayatollah who's now, in questionable health in his 80s, what happens should he die? Do we have any mechanism to influence the course of events? And basically, both the CIA and the State Department, often on opposite poles of the interagency debate, came back and said no. And after some resistance, a plan was hatched up in which the United States would sell arms to Iran, which, because of the Iraqi invasion, was quite desperate, in order to build leverage with certain Iranian political players. This transformed. Today we think about the Iran hostage crisis or the Iran-Contra crisis in the context of the illegalities of bypassing Congress to divert money to the Nicaraguan Contras. But at its root, the Iran-Contra crisis started as a diplomatic engagement with Iran in order to try to restore relations which had been broken 3 years previously. Bud McFarlane went over to Iran famously with a Bible and a cake shaped like a key. There were some tow missiles and some other spare parts which we were giving to the Iranians and so forth. Well, a couple things happened here. When Bud McFarlane, who had just resigned as National Security Advisor, got off the plane in Tehran, there was no one there to meet him. He was supposed to meet with Rafsanjani, one of the Speaker of the Parliament, one of the leading politicians, later was the president, one which many political officials describe as moderate. But Rafsanjani didn't show up, and he ended up being sequestered in this hotel with some third-string guys that weren't capable of making decisions. In the end, it went to naught. There's a couple lessons here. First of all, while there were some hostages released with the transfer of arms to the Iranians, as per the agreement, on the other hand, as soon as those hostages were released and the weapons shipments stopped, I believe something like 4 new hostages were seized within the course of a week. And so the issue of incentives, on one hand, incentives can be looked at as trying to grease a solution, to try to bring people into agreement. On the other hand, they can reward bad behavior. They can incentivize bad behavior. If by taking hostages we get weapons, well, let's take more hostages. They're like cash. The other issue, again, especially living in Washington, we tend to be very U.S.-centric. I don't think it's the problem with a community as international as, or with such international experiences as we have here. But how did the Iran hostage crisis actually break in the Western news? On one hand, you had an arms contractor. His plane gets shot down over Nicaragua, and this led to some exposure. On the other hand, however, it wasn't really broken in the United States. The first news of these contacts came out in a pro-Syrian Lebanese newspaper called As-Safir. 6 months later, after Bud McFarlane was actually involved, had come to Tehran after the talks had started and so forth, we had a situation where there were anonymous flyers tacked up at the University of Tehran asking what the American National Security Advisor, or former American National Security Advisor, was doing in Tehran. This was during a secret trip. How did this word leak? Did it leak out of the United States? No. Always when dealing with Iran, one hears about the differing power centers. And in this case, there was a competition between Hashemi Rafsanjani and a guy named Mehdi Hashemi. Mehdi Hashemi was the brother of the son-in-law of Ayatollah Khomeini's deputy. And it sounds kind of convoluted, but one thing which often isn't brought out about in analysis of Islamic Republic politics is just how intermarried the leadership is. Who's married to Khomeini's granddaughter, who's married to Khatami's niece, and so forth. It's quite an incestuous leadership, if you will, in terms of political incest. Now, there was this competition between the two. Mehdi Hashemi was the leader of something called the Office of Liberation Movements. It was the predecessor of what's now the Quds Force, which is often in the news, which is the movement, which is the unit of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps charged with export of revolution. He wanted absolutely no compromise. Rafsanjani was seen as a pragmatist. He wanted weapons for Iran to use in the Iran-Iraq war. Mehdi Hashemi trusted in God. He wasn't going to make any compromise with the great Satan. And so he wanted to embarrass Rafsanjani. And he leaked this to the press. And especially once it appeared in Lebanon, the U.S. press got a hold of it, and the White House couldn't deny it anymore. In the end, Mehdi Hashemi was executed. He was arrested and executed as part of the power struggle. He's no more, and Ayatollah Khomeini's former deputy, Hussein Ali Montazeri, is still under house arrest. The point being, though, while we look at the diplomacy within the context of the U.S. political debate, it's always wrong to assume that one's adversary is a blank template upon which U.S. policies play out. They have their own very active politics, and this is something which will reassert itself again and again. If I could just jump back to the Carter administration, what was the hostage crisis all about? Was it just about thumbing their nose at the Americans? No. What they did once they seized the embassy was selectively leak documents. As many of you know, diplomats, half their job is going out, interviewing men on the street, interviewing various politicians and officials to see where the country's heading and so forth. They would leak out who was meeting with the great Satan, and those people would be purged. Khomeini consolidated the revolution using the crisis of the hostage seizure. And you've had this vortex of revolutionary politics ever since. Anyway, this Iran-Contra affair it certainly undercut Reagan's second term. It neutralized any effect and any initiatives which Reagan had, and there was even talk at the time of impeachment and so forth. What about George H.W. Bush? George H.W. Bush came to power, and soon after, he got very lucky. Khomeini died on June 3rd, 1989, and 2 months later, Hashemi Rafsanjani was elected president. And many of the same talking heads you see now are quoted in the papers back in 1989 talking about what a forward-leaning pragmatist Rafsanjani was. And just like 8 years later, when Mohammad Khatami, the Iranian president, came to power and talked about a dialogue of civilizations, Rafsanjani used his inauguration speech to really reach out to the United States. And George H.W. Bush said, yes, we would love to talk with you. You can go back, and it may even be on Google, all the statements of Margaret Tutwiler, the White House press secretary at the time. Long story short, though, after the United States reached out and sought to engage Iran, Iran pulled back, and nothing happened. There's not much more to say with the George H.W. Bush administration, only because it was a one-term administration, and oftentimes within the U.S. context, most of the most far-flung diplomacy occurs during the second term. It's just the nature, whether you're Democrat or Republican, second-term administrations tend to take more risks because they're not worried about re-election. Clinton, ironically, when people say that George W. Bush was the antithesis of diplomacy, just all you're with us or against us, when you look back at the diplomatic history between Iran and the United States, Clinton was the president most resistant to diplomacy. In fact, it's under Clinton that you have the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which wasn't just pushed through by the Republicans. It had general bipartisan support, and Clinton had no problem signing it. And you also had 3 U.S. executive orders which put on the sanctions with regard to Iran, which we deal with today. It was only starting around 2002. It was only starting around 1999 and 2000 that Clinton really started to reach out to Iran. And here we also have a situation of taking into account different Iranian power centers and being mindful of what's going on in Iran. there are a few things going on in Iran at the time. First of all, the big episode towards the end of Clinton's administration was when, on the sidelines of the meetings with regard to Afghanistan, the 6+2 it was called, all the neighbors of Afghanistan, including Iran, plus Russia, plus the United States, there was a meeting at the United Nations. Everyone agreed that this would be a time for Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Iranian Foreign Minister Kamal Kharrazi to come down and sit together. And Madeleine Albright came into the room at the prescribed time, and Kamal Kharrazi didn't show up. What we know now is about 45 minutes before this meeting, he received a call from the office of the Supreme Leader and said, "Don't you dare go." And so we put our diplomatic prestige on the line. It was slapped down for various Iranian domestic political reasons. At the same time, under the Clinton administration, something came up which is a factor which we need to worry about today. All too often when we look at Iran, or when we look at any country, we look at the official wire diagrams of power and the legal mechanisms of power. But Iran, going back more than 100 years, has a history of what they call in Persian gurui fishari, translated roughly to pressure groups. During the Constitutional Revolution in 1906, these were secret societies which advocated for liberalism and did certain things which their mothers probably wouldn't be too proud of to make this happen. During the 1990s, this often involved extra constitutional gangs who would execute orders that couldn't be done legally. For example, the serial killings of Iranian intellectuals and political opponents, in which the Iranian deputy intelligence minister basically was arrested for, and he committed suicide in prison before he could talk to anyone about what had happened. He committed suicide by drinking hair removal cream. No one in the Iranian prison system was able to say why this man needed hair removal cream or how it got into prison in the first place. All we know is that one day he showed up dead. Now, this was also the case when Americans started going over to Iran for the dialogue of civilizations, and busloads of American businessmen were attacked. In one incident back in 1998, I believe it was, by a pressure group which threw stones at the windows, rocked the bus, basically said, "Get out of here or else." These are the same, basically fearing the security of the American visitors, we pulled out. The Germans have also complained about this group. And actually one thing which is open to anyone who wants it, about 5 or 6 times a week, my colleagues and I translate bullet point summaries of the Iranian press. Not talking opposition press, I'm talking the Revolutionary Guard's newspapers and websites, the Iranian financial papers, their equivalent to the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, to highlight what the Iranians are actually saying about themselves. And there was some political commentary recently, and I believe it was Aftabi Yazd, which is one of the more reform-leaning newspapers, which basically asked, why is it that under Khatami we had all these vigilante groups, and when Ahmadinejad is elected, suddenly they all disappear? This was in the context, yes?
Where can we find those?
If you give me your email address or take my card and email me, it's an email list of around 600 that goes to U.S. government officials, media, military practitioners, and then some folks in Europe and elsewhere, including actually in Iran, because one of the ironies of dealing with semi-autocratic regimes in the Middle East is they tend to get most of their information about what's going on in their country from outside their country. I can actually attest to this when I was in Iran during the 1999 student uprising, and we had no clue what was going on. It was only, and cell phones were cut off, internet access was cut off, and it was only after they were restored that we were able to see Time magazine and CNN stories online about what actually happened. All we knew was we smelled tear gas, and we were suddenly taken out of Tehran in a hurry to a podunk little town somewhere else. Now, so under Clinton, I'm sorry, you have this issue. The Germans have actually complained about these so-called pressure groups too, especially in the context of attacks on the German embassy and so forth. It's a way, if you will, to embarrass the government, but at the same time, anyone doing diplomacy in Washington has to come not only to an agreement on paper, but half the responsibility of diplomacy is ensuring that the person who you're making diplomacy with has the power to carry it out. Just as an example there, Bill Clinton showed up to Camp David II at the end of his term, expecting to have an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians and Yasser Arafat. He was shocked, and no president, whether they're Democrat or Republican, will put his political prestige on the line if he's afraid of getting egg on his face. He was told he had agreement. The Palestinian and Israeli negotiators had come to an agreement. Yasser Arafat turned out not to abide by the agreement his negotiators made. Conversely, when it came to U.S.-Libya diplomacy, the British handled the pre-diplomacy for that, and it took them 3 years to determine that the emissaries of Muammar Gaddafi actually were in power, that Muammar Gaddafi would actually do what his emissaries agreed to. And it was only then that the United States got actively involved in that diplomacy. Now, so you have this problem with vigilantism. And one can look at the original Iran hostage crisis as an example of vigilantism. If we were to send now a U.S. diplomat to Iran to head up an American interest section or something, what would happen to relations? What's the risk to relations if that diplomat is killed or taken hostage or kidnapped or disappeared? Especially since the pressure groups tend not to be random students on the street, but they drive the security service motorcycles. And if the foreign minister with whom we're negotiating doesn't have the power over the security service, how strong or how much confidence can we have in that agreement? These are all some of the issues which revolve around things. Reformism. Too often in the United States, we assume, I'd argue, that there's too much projection. We assume that our adversaries are just like us. They think just like us. But do Iranian diplomats go to the A100 class at the Foreign Service Academy, or do they learn their concept of diplomacy somewhere else? This goes into the issue of sincerity. Are our opponents always sincere, or is diplomacy a tactic for them? In fact, I think it was the Chinese, but I think this is in one of Pilbury's translations, which talks about diplomacy as being an asymmetric warfare tactic, insincere diplomacy, that is. Let's talk about reformism, dialogue of civilization. First and foremost, I'd say we have to talk about parity. At the height of the dialogue of civilizations, we granted the Iranian passport holders 22,000 visas. They granted us 800 visas. So there wasn't exactly parity when we talk about dialogue, and one often has to ask, what does this dialogue mean? Likewise, when we talk about Track 2 negotiations, this impacts that. When we invite Iranians over, fine. We have the regular question, are they empowered to talk for their government? When they grant people visas, are they only granting people visas whose views they want to hear, or are they going to grant people visas who may raise uncomfortable questions about nuclear proliferation, support for terrorism, or violent undermining of the Middle East peace process? So those are other issues with regard to Track 2. With regard to Mohammad Khatami's period, this goes back to sincerity. Between 2000 and 2005, European Union trade with Iran almost tripled in the name of engagement, moderating Iran, tying them into the world economy. During that period, you had an oil boom, and you had this hard currency influx, and it appears that about 70% of that oil boom and hard currency influx was diverted into military and nuclear programs. Now, it's one thing for some guy in a think tank to go over old financial statements, old budgets, old announcements in the Iranian press of various military commitments. It's another thing when Abdullah Ramazanzadeh, Mohammad Khatami's former spokesman, in a debate in June 2008 at the University of Gilan, debating some of Ahmadinejad's foreign policy advisors, said, you guys have done things all wrong, you guys being Ahmadinejad, all this Holocaust denial, all this rhetoric. What you've managed to do is get the Westerners to impose more sanctions on us. What you should have done was our strategy, which is dialogue and talk and lull them so that we can import everything we need for our projects. It doesn't exactly suggest sincerity, and indeed, just in the last 2 weeks, Khatami and Khatami's aides were saying that Khatami himself deserves the credit for the nuclear program in Iran, not to make the mistake of believing it was built under Ahmadinejad. And so this raises the question about whether reformism is an issue of style or an issue of substance. Now, I have 5 minutes left before we turn to questions, and the title of my talk was about, can diplomacy work? I'd argue it can. But fundamentally, what can make diplomacy cost is raising the costs of not adhering to diplomacy. There tends to be a problem in U.S. diplomacy in general and U.S. strategy, I'd argue, where we try to sequence diplomacy. where first we have diplomacy, and if that doesn't work, we have economic coercion, sanctions, and so forth. And if that doesn't work, as a last resort, there's military options, which may or may not be kinetic. And don't forget, deterrence and containment are both military options, but don't necessarily involve firing a single bullet. So let me put that aside and say part of the problem may be that we continually try, when we think strategically, we continually try to sequence our diplomacy rather than to use the military paradigm of the Tame model, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic components to strategy all being united into one. How did the Iran-Iraq war end? I started talking about it at the beginning. Well, Iraq, no doubt, Iraq invaded Iran. Iraq was in the wrong. But by 1982, the Iranians had pushed back the Iraqis to the front. Khomeini made a decision to keep on going. He wanted to basically rid the world of Saddam Hussein. And for 6 years, it was bloody stalemate. Up to 1 million people died in the war. It was reminiscent of World War I, with trench warfare, with mustard gas, with people rushing barbed wire into machine guns and so forth. It was a brutal, brutal conflict. And Khomeini, time and time again, swore that he would push on into victory. But finally, he got on the radio in May of 1988 and said that it was like drinking a chalice of poison, but that he had made this decision to agree to a ceasefire. Why did he agree to so-called drink a chalice of poison? And this is a phrase which repeats time and time again inside the Iranian media. He agreed to drink a chalice of poison because it simply got too expensive to continue. Iran had only so many young people, and the economy was in tatters. What's actually interesting, Mohsen Rezai, who was a Revolutionary Guard Corps chief, basically the commander-in-chief, who now owns a Persian-language news service called Tabnak, just about 3 days ago, his paper gave an editorial in which it was lambasting the so-called reformers. It was talking about the wisdom of Khamenei, the current supreme leader of Iran, and about how all these people under Khatami in 2003 wanted to sue for peace with the United States. But Khamenei in his wisdom stepped forward and prevented them from reaching any sort of agreement. And it said if they had reached an agreement in 2003 with the United States, if they had agreed to not interfere in the Middle East peace process, if they had agreed to cut off Hezbollah and so forth, then the revolution would have died. The converse of that, though, is that with the pressure that existed under Clinton administration in the first couple years of the Bush administration, that there had been significant inroads and significant debate inside Iran about whether to come to an agreement, whether in a way to make diplomacy work. Now, I could give talks on containment or deterrence, but we don't have the time because these are other assets of the strategy. I can deal with them during questions and answers. But with that, it's already 12:45. Promise not to run late. It's always annoying when people just like to hear themselves talk. And so why don't I open the floor to questions? Yes?
You can wait for the mic.
Like you talked about centers of power there in Iran. It sounds a lot like there's not really any united political front or any united political direction that Iran has. It sounds like it doesn't matter who we talk to, we might not be talking to the right person. We never know who exactly holds all the power in Iraq or in Iran, who we can count on to implement these diplomatic requirements that we have of Iran. That's kind of what it sounds like to me. So who is it that has the power there, and who is it that we need to be talking to?
Okay, first and foremost, your observation is correct. The one thing I would add is that this is something which the Iranians use to their advantage. If we wanted to look at this in an economic context, the Indians are always complaining that they strike gas deals with Iran. The price of gas goes up, and even though they have a signed piece of paper, suddenly they learn of some other body which hasn't agreed to this, and the Iranians try to scrap the commercial agreement. And this is indeed why, despite all the talk of all these oil companies doing business with Iran, none of these contracts are ever fulfilled because the Iranians tend to be their own worst enemy. The Iranians try to use this in their presence. Now, to directly answer your question, the chief power is the office of the supreme leader. You have the supreme leader, and then he has around 600 aides who basically infiltrate almost as political commissars down into every bureaucracy, and they basically rule by veto power. They have an idea of what's coming up through the bureaucracy, and they can put the kibosh on anything until something more acceptable comes up. The other thing to watch really closely, and one of my colleagues who we split between the American Enterprise Institute and the Royal Danish Defense College, Mr. Ali Alfona, has basically argued what Iran is undergoing is a slow creeping military coup d'etat, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps slowly infiltrating all different aspects of Iranian society. Already, there are more parliamentarians than at any time in history who have experience in the Revolutionary Guard. You have more governors and deputy governors, ministers and deputy ministers who are IRGC active service people or veterans. And this raises a question also about the official flowcharts and versus who you served with at the front, who you can call up to make something happen. And the last thing would be this includes into the economic arena. Revolutionary foundations, which don't have to adhere to the parliament, control about 35% of Iran's gross domestic product. At the same time, the IRGC has managed to take firmer grasp over the economy and over companies and use military power when necessary to enforce this, as the Romanians found out in the Persian Gulf when they had a signed contract with an Iranian company. And the IRGC decided to send a gunboat because the IRGC company called Khatam al-Anbiya wanted that contract instead. Likewise, the Turks have learned this a hard way repeatedly. When, for example, the Turks had the contract to build the new Imam Khomeini airport, on its inauguration day, I think in 2005, the first plane landed. And before the second plane could land, IRGC tanks were on the tarmac, basically turning away any other plane until the Austrian-Turkish conglomerate, which was running the airport, had its contract voided. And they did. So I'd say those two, the military and the supreme leader, are the powers that be. This is also ironic. When Hugo Chavez goes to Iran, he meets with the supreme leader. We act desperate to meet with the deputy assistant secretary of the foreign ministry. Sorry. Yes, sir.
At the risk of sounding like I'm supporting or defending the Iranian regime, which I'm not, and I don't support it, but here's the question that is at the tip of my mind. Would you not say that within their own context, the Iranian regime has what it sees as legitimate concerns and fears regarding its own interests, influence within the region, and that particularly regarding nuclear proliferation, obviously, and Khatami's decision to take on board that, their primary purpose is deterrence in order to be able to protect and push forward what they see as their legitimate concerns, rather than this, I think, in my opinion at least, overinflated fear we have in the West of these Iranians giving away this nuclear technology stroke bomb to any person or all comers or whatever, and which would basically destroy the very concept of a deterrence, because once you give it away, it no longer is a real deterrent. What do you think?
Okay. First of all, I agree that it's an inflated fear. My concern isn't that Iran would take a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb or what have you and drop it on Israel or any place else. My concern would be much more what it means to the non-proliferation regime, and also if Iran feels itself so secure behind this nuclear deterrence, whether it might lash out more conventionally. Back in 1999 when I was in Iran, the Iranians were supporting the PKK, this Kurdish terrorist group that fights in Turkey. And the Turkish Air Force came over and they accidentally bombed in Iran. The Iranians were in uproar. The Turks said, "Oh, we thought we were hitting camps in Iraq. We're sorry. We got our GPS wrong." What they actually did was hit every single Iranian Revolutionary Guard outpost around these camps. And the Turks apologized, but the Iranians took the message and stopped their support for the PKK for a while. If they have a nuclear deterrent, no one is going to be willing to do that. Now, with regard to legitimate concerns, this is where we get into timeline. The Iranian nuclear program dates to the mid-1980s. At the same time, if one believes the November 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, Iran was actually working on a nuclear warhead up until around 2003. The Iraqi one ended more or less in 1981, and then after, but Yes, but the point being, after that ended and long before 9/11, Iran was actually accelerating this program. And so that raises questions. You've also had, on one hand, you've had the supreme leader of Iran say that use of nuclear weapons is a sin. On the other hand, you've had several of his appointees. One of the most understudied areas of the Iranian bureaucracy is called the Office of the Friday Prayer Leaders, where every Friday, they basically serve as the chief commissar of the supreme leader in all the different provinces and then all the different districts and so forth. And you've had, for example, the Friday Prayer Leader. Most of them are Ayatollahs at that level. Some of them are Hojatul Islams who are a level below. And you've had, for example, the Friday Prayer Leader of West Azerbaijan talk about how it's Iran's right and gosh darn, we're going to do this. Now also, this is what Senator Coates and Senator Robb's Bipartisan Policy Council report did, was when you look at nuclear energy in terms of not the weapons program, but energy, Iran repeatedly says that it needs this for its own domestic political consumption. And indeed, Iran mines uranium. They've said that they want to build 8 nuclear reactors. Now the problem here is that if you do the number crunching at what Iran's uranium reserves are, how much uranium it would take to enrich, to 4.7 or 4.9% low-enriched uranium, which is what's used in fuel, for fuel and energy-producing nuclear reactors, you find that Iran only has enough nuclear fuel to last it for about 15 years to power this program. Now, on the same time, Iran is floating on a sea of gas. Most of its cities, 70% of its population, is already attached to pipeline networks. And for a fraction of the cost of what it's invested in the nuclear program, you could attach it to a gas energy generation component. Now, the other thing which is out there is just uncertainty, trust but verify. Most people don't realize that while UN inspectors go in, they only go in on average once a month. Now, Iran, with the amount of centrifuges it has, could, in theory, not at Natanz, but if it had another covert uranium enrichment facility, could enrich the low-enriched uranium for fuel to high-enriched uranium in as little as 17 days. I'm not saying they could build a bomb in 17 days. I'm just talking about producing 20 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Now, the problem here, and this is a solvable problem, is if we only do inspections once every month, we need to move inspections so they're more frequent than the amount of time it would take Iran to divert this amount of highly enriched nuclear fuel. At the same time, of course, we have video monitoring, but what most people don't realize is the IAEA doesn't doesn't monitor the videos in real time. They only monitor them about once a month as well. So this is where we get into the verification mechanism, which is lacking in our diplomacy right now. Excellent question. All the way in the back?
I know a lot of our Arab allies, especially the Gulf states, oppose any sort of diplomatic deals with Iran because they have their own tensions with Iran. Do you see that any of our own allies in the Middle East, including maybe even Israel, would try to undercut any diplomatic moves we make with Iran?
Ultimately, I think the Iranians are going to be doing the best at undercutting the diplomatic moves with Iran. I'd reframe this. So no, I think everyone wants diplomacy to work as a first resort, especially with the Persian Gulf allies, though. They worry about containment. Let me define containment to be a bit provocative as the ability of any of these states in the region to wage a war with Iran for 3 or 4 days before the cavalry could come in. Deterrence, to be at its most crude form, and Hillary Clinton referred to this during her campaign, would be the willingness to literally kill hundreds of thousands of people should Iran use nuclear weapons or any of its proxies. If we're not willing to address those issues, we have a problem. Now, since May of 2006, we've had something called the Gulf Security Dialogue with the GCC, which is basically meant to reinforce their capacity to defend themselves and also basically to defend themselves and to monitor and contain Iran. This is where we get into the congressional debates about the so-called JDAMs, the smart bombs that can go down air conditioner shafts and so forth, which are held up in Congress. This is also a little bit provocative, but we have something called the qualitative military review or something, which is what defines our relationship with Israel, where when we sell weaponry to Arab allies in the Middle East, we go through the quadrennial defense review to make sure that this doesn't harm Israel. Well, traditionally, there's no straight calculation, but this is reformulated saying, if we gave these JDAMs to Saudi Arabia, would they be used against Israel? Could they be used against Israel? And invariably, Congress will come in and hold things up. The problem is, I'd argue, that Israel and the moderate Arab states now share the same adversary. And it's unlikely that Qatar, Kuwait, even Saudi Arabia, I'd be more worried about Egypt, frankly, would use any of these weaponry against Israel. And therefore, when we calculate the quadrennial defense review, it may make more sense to reformulate it to take into account that Israel and many of these Arab states are confronting a common adversary. The last thing I would say, just taking a tangent from your question, there really are three different assessments of the threat in Iran. The U.S. strategic assessment is that a nuclear-capable Islamic Republic of Iran is strategically untenable. I say nuclear-capable because the threat isn't that Iran will develop bombs. From a U.S. policy perspective, the threat is that the Iranians will come within a week of building bombs, like Japan is right now, but with the ability to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and put those bombs together instantly. And that creates a real problem. From the European Union's perspective, they took the lead, the so-called EU3, Berlin, Paris, and London, with regard to Iran. And this was their first real attempt at a foreign policy initiative to solve a world problem, not just a little regional problem. Now, if Iran goes nuclear, if it tears up the Non-Proliferation Treaty, what this does is to multilateralism and the European philosophy of diplomacy what one could argue George Bush's invasion of Iraq and the national security strategy of 2002 did to the concept of unilateralism, and the pendulum will hence swing back. I'd say if U.S. sees Iran's nuclear weapons as strategically untenable, and Europe's concern is that it may make the multilateral system and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty void, and that could create a more dangerous situation. Israel has the third strategic assessment, which is Iran poses an existential threat to it. Now, this is the irony, of course, because we don't share the same assessment as Israel. However, Israel's, even if they don't think they can take out Iraq's program militarily, even if it's a long shot, they may try because they don't see this just as an issue of strategic untenability. They see this as an issue of existence. I don't think Israel can do it on its own. When we got together in the Coates Rob Commission to do this bipartisan policy council report, which is online, we had General Chuck Wald, four-star Air Force general who led the air campaign in Afghanistan, as one of our consultants. And what he figured is, unlike 1981 with OSIRAC, where we were able to take out, the Israelis were able to take out the nuclear reactor in one strike, Iran is 6 times the size of Great Britain. Even if you went in with surprise, you're not going to fly 700 miles out with surprise. And given that the Israelis aren't suicidal, you'd have to go after the various anti-aircraft defenses and so forth, the communication centers. And a conservative estimate would be this would take 1,400 sorties. Especially with hardened sites, you'd have to go in more than once to be sure. Israel can't do that, at least as far as I know. But the danger from a U.S. policy perspective, should diplomacy fail, and should this problem continue to get kicked down the road, is Israel, believing it's an existential threat, may try, knowing that they can't finish the job, but they can start it. In which point you have chaos. We have a decision about what we do. I'm sure the United Arab Emirates would use the opportunity to take the disputed islands back and onward. But with that happy note, maybe I should come to a conclusion because time is up. Thanks.